I would, in fact, like to thank NICE to invite me as a speaker in this very important forum. There is a lot of exchange of ideas happening right now. I have myself logged in to a few sessions. I can see that new ideas, research is being shared, and I do hope that this virtual space that NICE has provided under the leadership of Dr. Pramod facilitates the meeting of minds, and that I think is particularly needed when we are situated in South Asia. So, well, the broader theme that, as you all know, I would be talking about is non-traditional security issues. And I thought that rather than taking a specific case like my previous speaker, say, for instance, on energy security or water security, which of course are important themes to dwell on, to focus on, I will perhaps speak on the larger theme of non-traditional security, revisit this theme, and present to you an alternative way of approaching it. Now, let me mention here at the outset that the inspiration for some of these thoughts primarily comes from my own research on non-Western epistemologies, which I would say is a different way of understanding phenomena, different way of understanding the reality outside. And based on this understanding, I argue, as the previous speaker did, that the division between traditional and non-traditional is rather flawed. In fact, if one really looks at the intellectual legacies of South Asia, there is, in fact, a very different cosmovision that comes to the fore. And this cosmovision, I would argue, stems from a more holistic, a more composite, a more relational understanding of how we see or the intellectual legacies or the South Asian thought per se. So it's again this backdrop that I would argue that differentiating traditional from non-traditional security is somewhat alien to non-Western thought. In other words, what I'm really trying to say that security, development, micro and macro narratives were always interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent on each other. There was always an attempt to really approach phenomena in a comprehensive and a holistic manner. So to treat water security separately from national security, or energy security separate from economic or ecological, environmental security, I would say could be a misleading way to approach these very complex, wicked problems, as they're called, as we witness them in the 21st century. So in order to make myself clear, I shall, in fact, pick up two examples to perhaps develop this theme further. My first example is from the ancient text called Arthashastra, which we all know was a text on strategy written during the 4th to 2nd century BC. And the second example is primarily drawn from my own engagement in this thought, stemming from the Netherlands. And I juxtapose these two narratives for two important reasons. First, I think they can really help us to decolonize knowledge. We all know that non-Western ideas have lacked an agency in defining the character of international relations as a discipline, which was primarily built upon Western experiences and Western philosophical thought. And second, juxtaposing these two narratives also offers a very interesting contrast, but yet a very distinct similarity on the narratives from global South, or I should say from South Asia in particular. This is because both of the narratives that I shall be sharing with you belong to a very different genre altogether. The former, Arthashastra, belongs to the mainstream, often termed as, I would say, quote unquote, Brahmanical elitist tradition. And the other, more or less, is a part of a vernacular, popular, indigenous tradition, which lies really at the margins of South Asian thought. So I picked up on Arthashastra and thought of flagging it out here because it really talks about the very concepts we study as students of international relations today. It talks about power, it talks about morality, it talks about the idea of state and statecraft, it talks about justice, talks about order, so on and so forth. However, the question to my mind is that are these terms similar to how, say, a classical realist like Morgenthau or a structural realist like Kenneth Walls would use them? I have my doubts, as when Looking at the vocabularies in global south or in distinct geocultural spaces, one has to unpack them. Meanings move across geocultural spaces, and we need to recognize this. So, for example, a mere Shirmerian understanding of power will be very different from a Kautilyan understanding of power, or how even Sun Tzu would perhaps understand power. We therefore need to understand that vocabularies and terms are packed in a conceptual thicket, and we need to unlayer it by delving deeper into its own distinct intellectual and philosophical leanings. A similar meaning emerges from Arthashastra when we are, say, trying to understand its methodology and its approach to the definition of political. This definition of political is fascinating because it's a pre-Westphalian understanding of political, not really burdened with the idea of nation state. And I would say that this pre-Westphalian understanding of the political did not really look at states as a given, as a black box, which was really obsessed with anarchy and just augmenting power mindlessly. But the understanding primarily stemmed from a more cosmic understanding of dharma, which did not really have a theocratic understanding, but was a fluid interlocutor for translating the meaning of order, the meaning of justice, the meaning of duty, rights, power, state, etc. So this alternative cosmovision makes us familiar to practices of statecraft in early India. So for instance, when Arthashastra talks about power, it is directed towards strengthening the entity we define, say, as the state. The purpose of state was defined as achieving success, and success was further defined by the happiness of the people. Also, when it came to defining what constitutes an enemy or an ally, both human and non-human elements were taken into consideration, and I think this is important. So, for instance, disasters, hazards, famines, floods are considered kantaka, obstacles, by Kautilya. Said are obstacles which weakened the capacity of the state. These are clubbed with factors which actually destabilize a political system. Similarly, in battlefields or in war, when Kautilya talks about power, references are made to terrain, references are made to time, references are made to seasons, which, if employed in a far-sighted and a wise manner, can ensure victory. So if one negates these non-human elements, one is bound to get defeated. The point which I'm really trying to make here is that traditional and non-traditional was not really defined as high politics versus low politics, but was given equal weightage. The focus was on how the macro and the micro were so intertwined and braided with each other that a relational understanding, which is the study of relations, rather than a substantialist understanding, the study of objects like states, was privileged. Now, let me take you to this recent project, where I undertook research on how water was understood by indigenous communities inhabiting the Meghna Basin in Bangladesh-India border. Now, in this project, we as a team of researchers focused on select indigenous communities residing along the Meghna Basin. These were primarily the Khasi community from Meghalaya, Pumai community in Manipur, the Hajong, Khasis, and the Garos located in the Sylhet division of Bangladesh. Now, while we navigated this question at two levels, the empirical and the conceptual level, there were interesting sort of insights similar to my own Kautilyan understanding which emerged. And let me highlight to you a narrative which was shared by an indigenous woman in Bangladesh. And I would like to quote her because I think it's fantastic. It will really be violent for me to not really speak the way she did. Now she says, and I quote here, where there is a forest, there is Khasi people, as our life depends on forest and our livelihood on beetle leaves. Either in Bangladesh or in India, where there is a forest, there is Khasi. Now, these enlightening words were articulated by a woman, as I said, in a small town of Maulazar in the Sylhet division of Bangladesh. And she further said, care of forest means taking care of stones, means taking care of stream, means taking care of trees, and that without stream and water, there would be no trees, and no trees.
Oh, Dr. Medha, are you still there?
I am there.
Oh, yeah, because we lost you for a couple of
Okay.
seconds. Can you repeat that, please?
So am I, so where did you lose me? Where did you lose me? I'm sorry.
Yes, well, your voice just got lost for a few
Okay.
seconds. Can you repeat
All right.
what you said just before that?
Okay, all right. So, what I was doing essentially in the previous few seconds was that I was really trying to communicate this imagery of the ecosystem from the lens of a Khasi indigenous woman who doesn't really see water as separate. In her words, water and the forest were not really separate. Water meant the forest, water meant the sediment, water meant the livelihood. And I would say that these lines are not only instructive of a holistic relational understanding of the environment, which urges us to look at the ecosystem rather than having a compartmentalized approach where we look at energy security, food security, water security, national security separate through a siloed approach. So what is also instructive here, I would say, is an alternative way of organizing knowledge, thus focusing on ways of knowing, understanding, and viewing the world. And a scholar rightly puts it that what one really understands from this indigenous thought is an alignment of social, ecological, and spiritual frames, which is indicative of ways through which indigenous communities privilege both human and non-human factors in the environment. In other words, what one can say is that the social, and Bruno Latour has in fact worked on that, the social in indigenous thought includes both human and non-human elements. As for them, the kin or the relatives include the natural elements of the ecosystem. If one looks at the literature, many have started using the term pluriverse instead of universe in terms of understanding alternative thought systems, which need to be included for understanding the international. And this understanding, I think, needs to be deliberated more by scholars who are interested in making sense of non-Western thought in the theorization and praxis of international relations. And this, to my mind, is important for a post-colonial strategic space like South Asia, which has colonial footprints when it really comes to dealing with complex, non-linear, but also interdependent challenges which we face in the 21st century. So against this backdrop, I assume there are many young minds who are listening to this. I thought of just offering 3 key insights for you to deliberate on. And this is something that I have been investing in for some years now. First, I would like to say that when we think about non-traditional security issues, one needs to go beyond the meta-narrative of water diplomacy or energy security or water security. If one really looks at, say, the epics of Mahabharata or classics like Arthashastra, the meta-narrative were braided with the micro-narrative. Unfortunately, in post-colonial spaces like South Asia, our meta-narratives of security and development are quite distant from the micro-realities on the ground. We need to involve and expose ourselves to the field, and our field here, I would say, are not policy speeches and documents and IR theory textbooks, but narratives of the people who experience and live these issues. The first challenge of non-traditional security, therefore, is how do we really bridge the gap and start a conversation between diplomacy and governance. Second, what also merits our attention is to explore what our own intellectual and philosophical South Asian thought has to offer us when we think about the political. Now, there is a rich pedigree when you want to understand the distinct civilizational values and the syncretic thought which emerged here. For instance, what was South Asian, how was South Asian Islam different? What does Buddhist thought has to offer us when we are thinking about conflict transformation? How does Kautilya refer to issues of war and peace? Significantly, if you look at Divyopradesha, written by Prithvinarayan Shah, one really sees how it is adapted to suit foreign policy of small states. What I'm really trying to say here is that understanding social thought in South Asia is equally important. These would give us definitely some strategic insights on how to address complex problems. And lastly, I'll just wind up that third, as we talk about non-traditional security issues, our imagination of South Asia should not be dominated by a territorial Westphalian understanding, which is governed by the idea of a nation state. It is important that we differentiate between an ethnic nation and a civic nation, because only if we do this, we can imagine South Asia differently. We can go beyond the definition of South Asia, not restricting our definition to South Asia just as a of states, but rather defining it as a community of through its ecological charter, not its hard border, sovereignty bargains starting point. But through the interdependencies that South Asian states have with each other. Only then, I would say, can policies and cooperation around non-traditional security issues in South Asia, would perhaps be more effective. So I hope I didn't exceed my time limit, but over to you, Chair, now. Thank you.